Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the eLearning Africa podcast. I'm Rob Bemba. This podcast is brought to you by eLearning Africa, the Pan-African network for ICT for education, training and skills development, Africa's home for ideas, innovation and sustainable solutions for education, training and skills development since 2005. In this episode of the podcast, I'm in conversation with Barbara Moser Mercer.
A bit overworked, but I think that's that's the sign of the times, right? And the poor computers are strained to the max.
In our conversation, Barbara spoke passionately of the importance of a human-centered approach to technological advancements and warned of the risk in pushing for more technology. She explains why she believes the digital divide is so serious and why the access argument is a facile one. We spoke of the real impact of the pandemic that it's having on the mental and emotional well-being of people, yes, as a result of the coronavirus, but also because of how the world of work has changed. Barbara also shares about her work in Africa, specifically talking about higher education in forced displacement contexts, and explains why it requires a utilitarian approach to education, a stance she would not ordinarily take. Barbara Moser Mercer is Professor Emerita and founder of InZone, a program of the University of Geneva which pioneers innovative approaches to higher education in communities affected by conflict and humanitarian crises, with the ultimate goal of empowering people on the move stranded in transit countries. InZone gives special attention to refugees and asylum seekers stranded in fragile states, but at the same time fosters an inclusive approach, including people on the move more broadly, as well as vulnerable host communities. Barbara is visiting professor at the University of Nairobi, engaged in strengthening African solutions that advance higher education in emergencies, and currently coordinating the launch phase of the African Higher Education in Emergencies Network. Following her initial training as a conference interpreter, she pursued her studies in psycholinguistics and cognitive psychology. Her research has focused on the development of expertise in complex cognitive skills of bilinguals, both from a cognitive psychology and a cognitive neuroscience perspective. These findings have been instrumental in informing the design and the development of student-centered multilingual digital learning environments in fragile contexts, which she has leveraged across several refugee camps in Africa and the Middle East. Taking us not too far back to the start of your career, and I'm always interested in how people land where they land to start with. So, how it is that you came to be a conference interpreter. Is that by mistake? Is it by accident? Is it fully intentional?
Well, that's indeed an interesting question that I haven't asked myself in a long time. But I think at the time it was actually a decision taken for convenience, and in a very traditional way, where I thought, well, as a woman, what kind of profession could you choose that you could continue to carry out when you have a family, and it would be freelancing, and you could use some of your skills. So that kind of led me into that direction, and the rest is history. I've actually changed my view on what this profession offers, and I don't know whether you know that I still work as a professional conference interpreter. Not very much anymore, but I still keep my hand in it. I think it's good for the brain. It's incredibly fascinating to be on the front line of where knowledge is created and policies are negotiated. And because I've now really reduced my work to one of the UN specialized agencies, the International Labour Organization, it really merges extremely well with the rest of what I do. So in a way, I've come full circle. But yes, I just emerged from 3 weeks in Geneva again from the International Labour Conference, and we touched upon all manner of things that are incredibly important in the new world that we live in now.
And certainly very keen to get into a lot of the new world as we look at it going forward. But I want to stick with the patriarchal framework that you had considered. And I guess the question is, was it self-imposed to an extent? Did you feel like you had many options, but this was the option whether by virtue of where you found yourself, upbringing, society? What was the main driver behind thinking, well, I need to fulfill all of these roles of mother and have a career that relies on
Right. Yeah, I think I was just at the beginning of that era, where women were beginning to question, but we weren't quite at a point yet where we could throw out the baby with the bathwater. We couldn't just, ditch everything that was expected of us. But yes, I actually came from economics. So I'm Austrian. I was born in Germany, raised in Austria. And Austria has a number of specialized secondary schools that last a little bit longer than your traditional secondary school, but also give you a professional license. So actually, I went to a specialized secondary school doing the baccalaureate in economics and finance. So that's my background, which stands me to very good use in preparing grant applications and monitoring and evaluation and all sorts of things. So every skill set I've ever acquired really is helpful still, and it also gave me a business license. So I actually was ready to open my own business and could do so. But decided, okay, I'll go and work for a year, earn my money to then go and study. And during that year, I think my resolve really was strengthened to no, you're never ever going to get anywhere as a woman. You will stay being a secretary for the rest of your life, unless you get out of here. And so after a year, I left, and I think little by little, then it was just the early 70s. And I think, the women's movement, slowly began to gather momentum. And I think I had a brother who was extremely active, politically and otherwise. And I think some of that rubbed off on his younger sister. Although I still wasn't quite as courageous as he was. So I think that's a little bit where, where things were beginning to shape or get shaped. Yeah, the rest is then basically looking at a fairly traditional academic career, getting your PhD and doing the research. And but because it was in conference interpreting, there was always this one foot in a profession and the other foot in academe, and marrying the two as the field of translation and interpreting studies was trying to develop or have an academic reputation, which was difficult and continues to be difficult to this day, because it's a multidisciplinary kind of field. I think that never ever pushed me to be a pure academic. I always had a very strong connection to reality. And I've always felt that if we're going to produce knowledge, it has to be useful for something. And so I was much more in the applied research, or adopted the applied research orientation, although in cognitive psychology, as you know, things can be very, very laboratory oriented. And but then, I always picked out those areas that I felt, could benefit from a little push. And I said, well, how can you work on ecological validity and laboratory research? How can we make those results more policy relevant? How can we change the working conditions of interpreters? So yeah, you can see how things evolved slowly, but there was a certain there's a certain rationale to it, in hindsight at least.
And has it been, I want to use the word frustrating, but I also don't want to be leading, and I guess I've just done that, in your dealings with policymakers over the years and having to interpret all of these various policies into various languages. And I would assume the benefit of psycholinguistics and cognitive psychology is it's deeper than the average Joe or Jane in the street who just hears language and whether, automatically just hears the words for what they are. You're thinking on multiple layers beneath the surface. Is there, as far as these policymakers go and making policy at a think tank higher level, is it more frustrating for you because you can see so much further and deeper into what is needed on the ground because you have a better understanding? Do you believe you have a better understanding of what people are actually asking for and what they actually need?
Yeah, and I do believe I continue to make myself somewhat unpopular, because at this stage in my career, I don't have to make a career anymore. I don't have to be careful, and I always make sure that whatever I pinpoint, whatever I raise, there is sufficient evidence on which I can base it, and reliable evidence and quality evidence. But yeah, if anything, I've become much more principled in it, and I think that has been further strengthened by my involvement in the humanitarian sector. I continue to think that it's a huge advantage that I don't have the background in development studies and wasn't trained as a humanitarian. I still approach the field from my own field of research and the scientific background of psychology. And I really am quite intent on keeping that perspective. I think it's helpful that while you're acting within that sector, you are not a product of that sector, but you can continue to have that external view, and hopefully a more objective view, weighing, the pros and cons of what is possible and what is feasible. I think one of the incredible advantages of being a conference interpreter at that level, and interpreting all these meetings in multilateral organizations and watching how international policy is being developed and how it's negotiated. I've learned an incredible amount. It's kind of passive learning, because you're in it and you're actually interpreting it, but you do this over the years, and something has to rub off. And it clearly has rubbed off. It's really helped me, work in the humanitarian sector that is made up of so many different clusters, that how they relate to each other and how they don't relate, and often led by UN agencies and how these agencies work. So knowing the internal way of working of those different agencies has really helped me, on the one hand, be more how shall I put it, to be more accommodating, because I know just how darn difficult it is to arrive at consensus, while at the same time also looking for opportunities where you can really push, and also taking certain risks where I tell myself, okay, it's up to here and no further. Yeah, we're not going to go down that path. This is not acceptable. This is this is this counters values that I uphold, and principles that I uphold. And as a linguist, I think also making sure that the way you present things, it's making people feel that yes, their opinions are respected. I may not agree with them, and we may not be able to implement them, and finding ways to compromise. And I think in all these negotiations, what you really learn is from the very best of chairs, and there have been female and male chairs in the UN system that I've seen at work, that I am absolutely enamored with. It's a skill. It is really a skill to run a meeting. And it can make or break, a negotiation. It can make or break a deal, and it can make or break how your values are, what chance you have in getting your values accepted and really implementing and effecting change. So yeah, I think that it's really important still to me. And every time I go into an international meeting, I always look out for, what kind of tricks, what kind of strategy. And I think that's what's fascinating about the International Labour Organization, because it's the only organization in the UN system that has a tripartite membership. So you have the workers, the employers, and you have the governments. And you see, the social contract being negotiated and renegotiated. And, you have the different partners having to grapple with issues and still arriving at compromise. And I think I've learned a great deal from absolutely remarkable leadership in those different groups, watching them, how they strategize, because you interpret each group separately, and then you go into the plenary and you see how the strategy plays out. And what works and what doesn't work. It's quite fascinating. But again, always opportunities to learn.
I'm so glad you're fresh, kind of out of another conference, and you've have your wealth of experience pre-COVID and now experience during COVID. So this is another multi-part question. But how would you frame the global challenge, and then as specific as one can be from a bird's eye view with Africa's challenges pre-COVID, and how has that changed? Again, I'll lead with the question, being exacerbated by COVID. Have you seen this play out in these meetings, but also just from your personal vantage point with all of your experience being at the forefront of these conversations? Are you noticing sizable changes in those conversations?
Yes, I think it goes without saying that the pandemic obviously has overshadowed just about every discussion. It doesn't matter what topic you pick up. It's always, oh, well, now there's the pandemic and, things have changed. And clearly, well, at the ILO, a great deal has been about decent work, about unemployment, about the incredible changes that workers in general now are being pushed through, and just how many are being left behind. I think one of the kind of the key reports that had come out over the last 2 years from the Future of Work Commission, which I had the privilege of interpreting on several meetings and actually led ably by Ramaphosa at the ILO. That report clearly outlined the importance of a human-centered approach. And I think it's been that call for action. We do understand that technology is enabling certain ways of working. But we cannot sell out to that being the only approach and the only solution. And I would like to create a link there between the work, the world as a whole, the global perspective, and how I see this for Africa. I think in many ways, technology, Africa has been able to leapfrog in many ways, and that's been really its incredible advantage. They haven't even touched certain technologies because they didn't need to, and I think in many ways they perform at an incredibly high level when it comes to technological innovations and the use of technology. And having lived in different countries in Europe and in the US, I do have a certain basis of comparison. It is remarkable. However, I think it's also I see a risk in that, in as far as they push for more technology and AI, being the latest call to action. More of that crowds out the need for us to not lose sight of the human beings that actually are using that technology. And I think increasingly human beings are being marginalized. Yeah, and there are so many contradictions in all of this. Yeah, the more technology we use, the fewer human beings we need to run certain things. and unemployment rises, and people are forced, to retool, to be up to date on all sorts of technologies, and it's frustrating for them, and they give up. And their value as human beings is being undermined. And I think I would hope that on the African continent, traditions and cultural traditions, will survive that push, because the push is relentless, and it's relentless, especially in development contexts. Yeah. So how does the continent manage to stand up to this? And I'm not, an expert. I'm not I haven't studied political science, and I haven't studied geography. So my knowledge of Africa comes from working in Africa and working with African institutions and working in refugee contexts. So again, it's not an academic background that I have, but the way I see institutions function, especially academic institutions or the humanitarian context function, I'm very, very concerned about losing sight of human beings. And I think we have the pandemic, and yeah, it's the fourth wave now, but I would say almost overshadowing is the real impact on mental well-being and emotional well-being of people. I mean, there is a pandemic out there that, yes, people are talking about, but we don't have the numbers yet. But the numbers, even estimates, conservative estimates would say that more than 50% of all people, are seriously affected mentally and emotionally by what is going on. And it's not just that you can't go outside, or you are in quarantine, or you can't travel. Or the fear of contracting the illness. It's about how the world of work has changed, and people I work with, virtually. We all bemoan at this point the fact that we have to meet virtually, and just how our computer screens are just completely awash with virtual meetings. And when can we meet in person again? When can we have those conversations again? How can we do that? And I see kind of a dual development that concerns me a great deal. And I would hope that African culture and tradition of community, of being together, of working together, will hopefully be strong enough to counteract what is a highly individualistic approach to getting things done.
It certainly has been and felt like, too much, too fast, too soon. Sitting in South Africa, where I'm sitting, we're still trying to get over the peak of the third wave, and again, we're anticipating the fourth. The level and degree to which this has disrupted lives on macro and micro, on just all levels, and you're absolutely spot on what this has done to people mentally in terms of their health and well-being. We haven't gotten anywhere close to grasping just the devastation that this has caused. We see the totality of the numbers in the deaths, or probably more telling, the excess death figures that come through. All of that to say, again, within the African context, we've been kind of crying out for change for so long, for a better life, for equality, for health and services and water, the climate crisis. And it feels like it's all kind of just come to a head, but not many solutions seemingly in sight right now, as we're still in the weeds. Do you see many opportunities amidst all of these challenges? Where's your level of optimism? And I ask this not knowing generally in life where you would fall on a kind of optimistic versus pessimistic scale.
Well, I'd like to say that no, I'm not an internal optimist. That's for sure. I do have, yeah, I worry. I worry about certain developments, and I've just outlined a little bit, what I really worry about for the African continent. I mean, I worry about that for the global north as well. But I think we're so far into technology being sold to us as a solution for just about everything and anything, that I'm not very optimistic that we're going to be able to turn this around. I'm just hoping that Africa, can keep its 2 feet on the ground and be realistic about this, because if that kind of approach is implemented on the continent, then indeed you're going to be leaving the majority of the populations behind. The digital divide is already, fairly serious. But asking ourselves, why is that digital divide serious? It's serious because not because so many people don't have access to connectivity. And for me, this is a facile conclusion. Yeah, it's serious because we are basically selling this as the only solution. Now, if we weren't selling technology as the only solution, people wouldn't be left behind, because we would be rethinking about, well, how else can we integrate people? How else can, education work? How else can learning work? How else can everyone have access to education? But all that I'm hearing is, well, we need to have more connectivity. We need to have more computers in the hands of people. Well, you're never, ever going to cover everyone. You're not even going to go much beyond, 60% perhaps on the continent in terms of a working laptop that, and power supply in remote villages. So are you now saying, well, everyone has to move to cities so that they can have connectivity and have a computer in their hands to learn? I think, it's so short-sighted. And I would hope that the strength of African cultures in terms of the communities and lifestyles. Yes, there is poverty, and yes, there is shortage of this, and yes, there is lack of water, and yes, there is lack of health care systems, and yes, technology can alleviate some of these, but these are not the only solutions. And I think we need to get young people to kind of not get totally wrapped up in technology is the only way we're going to solve it. How many pitches do we have about, technology solving this problem and that problem and every other problem? Technology isn't, the savior of everything. And, this may not fit exactly into eLearning Africa now. But, education, when you go back into kind of hallmark treaties on education, especially in the kinds of context that we are talking about for Africa, the pedagogy of the oppressed, Freire, and this does not ride on technology. Yeah, it rides on what we would call humanizing pedagogy. And for humanizing pedagogy, yes, technology can be very useful, and we should use it whenever we can, but only to achieve the kinds of outcomes that advances our well-being as a society, as brings peace and livelihoods to people. So for me, there are too many voices pushing for one tool that is going to solve everything, and I think it's a very single track type of thinking these days. And I can see the pandemic has, because we've all managed to do things, with the kind of web conferencing technology platforms that we now have, and we've all had to learn to tool up fast. Yes, it has helped us stay together and continue to work. In a crisis, we've all had to adjust very quickly. But, there is a world of difference between kind of emergency remote teaching and quality digital learning. And I think that's, for me, the essence of what I am concerned about. And where I feel that in humanitarian contexts, there is, because of the dearth of connectivity, there is an immense opportunity to showcase that it's not all about technology. Here are ways in which, we can reach even the most marginalized, and, where they can actually build solutions that, can act kind of as reverse innovation. Well, let us show you. And they showed us, they showed us during the pandemic just how good they were, how they found solutions, how imaginative and creative they were. And I'm just worried that maybe, what they were able to show us, they were the experts in the world. They were better than many, in the global north about, how to learn in these contexts. But, the north has caught up. and so I'm concerned, that will not now be relegated again to the sidelines.
Let's talk about some of those specific examples and your work as a visiting professor at the University of Nairobi and coordinating the launch phase of the African Higher Education in Emergencies Network. I mean, tell me about the network and the general concept of higher education in emergencies.
Yeah, so I've run networks before and been involved in their creation. This was an invitation from a donor that kind of surprised me, but going back to the beginning of our conversations about principles and values, when the donor said, well, we would like for you to be involved in this, to design this, but yes, you're associated with the university in the north, and if this design were to fly, it would move to the south entirely. So being at the stage of my career that I was at, I knew I was going to be, retiring from the University of Geneva. I thought, yeah, this is a real good challenge. And I think the time is ripe. And I do think I've got some skills that I could probably at least design together with some other experts. We could design it. But the most important part was really having the incredible opportunity given by a donor with foresight, who said, we would like to see what Africa can do. And I said, well, I'm a white woman coming from the north. Am I the right person to do this? So I did have my questions about me being that person, but I also knew that I had sufficient experience on the continent and a good network already, and that I wasn't necessarily seen as somebody coming from the north and imposing anything. So I did have that reputation already. So yeah, the design phase was fascinating, created a lot of enthusiasm and energy. Came at a time, this was before, the renewed announcement of camp closure in Kenya, came at a time where, yeah, solutions for forced displacement, had to be implemented. It was post the New York Declaration, the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, the Global Compact. So there was a political environment that had already been created that really allowed us to move forward much more quickly than we could have moved, say 5 years ago. So we're talking post 2016, 2018 now. There was the World Humanitarian Summit. There was all this talk about localization and, more power and more funding in the hands of locals. So I think we had a political environment and context that really facilitated the setting up of such a network. And we had university actors who were interested and who also felt that, yes, we would like to show what we can do. So there was this, after, decades of development where there was always an imbalance, between who had the money and who had the say in development projects and, who was basically solicited as enumerators in research projects, for whom was the knowledge production. And so I think there was a certain feeling of, yes, we actually should be able to showcase what we can do. And so working with an incredible group of people was really instrumental in designing the project together, and focusing on those countries that produced the largest number of refugees and those that hosted the largest number of refugees in the beginning. The idea is that, you know, we spread out over the continent, and we're doing this right now. I can get into that in a moment. And to make sure that we were a group of actors who were in agreement with regard to the importance of those on the ground having an important role to play in the design and in the co-design. So this is how we then kind of moved into the launch phase with not a huge budget, but yes, we were able to, you know, retain the first donor and obtain grants from a couple of other donors to go into the launch phase, which will complete at the end of next year. And we wanted to be very straightforward and simple. We felt that we do not want to be everything to everyone. After, you know, all the years I'd spent in higher education in emergencies, I had come to the conclusion that higher education in a forced displacement context needs to put food on the table. It needs to lead to dignified livelihoods. Yeah, I am usually not, you know, a proponent of a utilitarian approach to higher education. I would not be. And I wouldn't be in a context in the North. But in those contexts, I have absolutely come to the conclusion that unless people can be self-reliant and put food on the table and get their children to school, nothing is going to happen. So the network really focuses on employability through higher education. And all these hours spent in high-level meetings and policy discussions also, you know, have convinced me of the importance of keeping your outcomes clear, to the point. And this is, you know, you cannot solve all the problems in the world, but, you know, if you have very clear outcomes that are succinctly stated, you can measure them, and you can convince others that you can actually reach them, and, you know, how much funding you ultimately need to reach them. So this is where we are at. We did our market analysis in refugee camps about, you know, what are the areas that are most likely going to provide jobs for refugees in the context that they're in. So we really were totally opposed to including a strand of what we would call a scholarship model that takes refugees out of their context, sends them somewhere off, and they will obviously never come back. And this is now actively promoted also by UNHCR as the alternative path to resettlement. You've just seen a glimpse of it at the Olympics as well. You know, you're an athlete, okay, you know, we'll offer you resettlement. You know, you can now go to university in another country. So we felt that the network needed to uplift communities and not just individuals. Really going, you know, embracing fully, you know, what in my mind characterizes African cultures and what I admire, and it's the community spirit. Yeah. And that's so diametrically opposed to the North and the West, you know, where it's individualism that counts. And, you know, hoping that, you know, with these values, we are actually strengthening, you know, traditional values that are absolutely essential and that, you know, have shown to work. Because, yeah, as the pandemic broke out, if it hadn't been for community spirit and community creativity and you know, getting things done, communities would have, you know, kind of, yeah, suffered greatly. Yes, they have suffered, but they haven't suffered in the same way that everyone in the North predicted they would. So why didn't they? Because there was community. And how can you strengthen that? Not with an individualistic approach. Yeah, you have to keep strengthening that. And that's what the network really does. Yes, we have scholarships for students. Obviously, refugees are not paying for their education, but they have to give back to their communities. So we are just launching now the first program that the students themselves have designed. They went out, they analyzed the needs of their community. They came back with suggestions as to, how they can give back to their communities with the skill sets that they have acquired. So it's really empowering people to design solutions for themselves, using their higher education skills to design these solutions, but also making it clear to them, yes, you are now somewhat privileged because you have a scholarship, but you need to work for it. Yeah. The price is not resettlement. The price is actually strengthening your community. So the price is not, for you as individual. The price to pay is, helping the community. So that kind of characterizes the values of the higher education emergencies network that we hope to, continue to strengthen and to amplify across the continent.
The more you keep talking, and the more I keep thinking of the South African expression of Ubuntu, which I don't know whether you're familiar with it. I am because you are. And that feels like it's embedded in everything that you're trying to do. How, and I feel, having now engaged you for the past little while, that this might be considered a swear word, but connected to the aim with technology and digital learning in particular, the next obvious question is always scalability, right? How can we scale this? How do we spread this? So within your context and what you're doing, you mentioned doing market research as you went out with this project. How do we make sure that this mushrooms and grows to the rest of the continent and beyond?
Yes, it's clearly, it's been a little bit learning by doing also, and looking at opportunities and grabbing them when they present themselves. But I'm also convinced that opportunities don't just present themselves. Your mindset identifies what is relevant to the implementation of your principles. And so we are selective in the way, we approach the world around us. The moment you have an assignment to do, all of a sudden, you see things that are related to your assignment everywhere, isn't it? So yeah, the psychologist in me obviously, operates on those principles and knows how they, how they can strengthen, the impact of your work. So the idea was that we would start in the Horn of Africa for the reasons that I'd mentioned, and that we would then move mostly into West Africa to cover the French speaking part. And clearly that would not be a big problem for me, having worked in the French-speaking university for over 30 years, so that was fine. And yes, there were still some linkages that we thought we would explore, and then moving further south. Well, the development of the network actually, it has immediately given us this incredible opportunity to work with the African Digital University Network out of Stellenbosch University. So that was already a huge advantage. And they really have put together a wonderful program on quality digital learning, digital pedagogy in fragile contexts, headed as a working group. So already, we are in with that network. And I think that kind of led me to the idea that rather than looking at individual member universities that would implement diploma programs, which continues to be very important, why don't we look at other African networks that already exist? So rather than, growing our footprint one by one and going through the negotiations one by one, why don't we link up with other networks? And I think this is also how the connection with Rebecca came about. I mean, I was aware and I participated in a couple of eLearning Africa conferences. So I was obviously very, very much aware, but I thought, let's grow by linking up with other networks that are relevant to the kinds of diplomas that we run. So, and indeed, the first network that we have already linked up with is the Education for Sustainable Development in Africa network, United Nations University Initiative. The next one that we're discussing with now is the Peri U network, which focuses on disaster risk management. So also very relevant, but brings 12 universities. So once we really connect, all of a sudden, there are 12 more. And, we can then identify diplomas that, would contribute again in the refugee context in other parts of Africa. So that's a little bit, has become our growth our growth pattern, so to speak. And it also highlights the areas on which we focus. So disaster preparedness and disaster risk management is terribly relevant, as is teacher education, as is multilingual communication. It's surprising, but it's true. It is indeed needed. So that's how we see our growth. I must say I've been a little bit surprised. Research wasn't one of our key outcomes that we, feature. But that is actually where we've had a lot of solicitation over the last 3 months, and already implemented a small pilot study, all related to the role of refugees. In this case, it was the role of refugees in sustainable urban development. So we started with a small pilot study. We just acquired a grant from the UK Arts and Humanities Research Council on peace building, and the skill sets and the arts that we're also implementing in two contexts. One in Kenya, in Kakuma, the other one for the Tigray response. So showcasing, how specific approaches can lead to better peace building, better quality peace building, sustainable peace building. So more research is actually coming our way, and while that is a bit surprising, I think it's going to have to change a little bit the way we're seeing our role as as elevating those who are students under the umbrella of the African Higher Education Emergencies Network, but elevating their skill sets and making sure that they are the drivers in knowledge production, and that they are the ones who identify the knowledge gaps. That it's not somebody in the North who is identifying a knowledge gap and then doing the research and basically not returning the results to the communities on which they researched, but really changing the pattern, moving the drive, well, basically empowering the drivers and looking at research ethics in these fragile contexts that are really sound, and make sure that, yes, livelihoods can be created. So a number of the students already are earning money that way. But we also make sure that they are not just making money as enumerators, that they are indeed intimately involved in identifying the research questions and also in participatory methods of knowledge production.
And so vitally important that they are at the forefront in determining the what, right? It's we're so obsessed of how we teach, and the platform, the medium that's used, and forgetting about that all important what. I mean, looking at the UN's IPCC report this week that had all the very appropriately so bold, scary headlines. There was one or two stats that the typical headline grabbing stuff of how each of the past 4 decades has been successively warmer than any that preceded it. I mean, it's incredible. It is headline grabbing, and rightfully so. And what that ultimately means, again, in terms of more and more refugees, people being displaced because of conditions that are just not livable. We spoke about, access to healthcare, lack of water. Is there a particular dominant profile in terms of the average student that comes to you, with an age or gender bias? Or
I think there are a couple of things I can say about that, and it is really work in progress. These are tough issues to grapple with, because we're still dealing with government regulations that are not adapted to a world in migration. So while there are declarations and international instruments and national that governments have signed up to, but there's obviously a huge gap between having signed and hopefully also ratified and actually implementing and integrating it into national law. And even if it's integrated into national law, it's still it's a long way to an actual implementation process. So for right now, and basically because we focused on the Horn of Africa and mostly Kenyan institutions right now offering those diplomas, these students need to meet the requirements of the Commission for University Education, to which all the universities in Kenya are accountable. So their hands are a little bit tied as well. But we are working on a piece. I've been working on a piece actually for 2 or 3 years already on compromise solutions in a refugee context. For example, where you cannot verify the authenticity of a document that a refugee brings without actually contacting his country of origin or her country of origin. But that, however, it runs counter to the 1951 Refugee Convention, because it would mean exposing the geographical location of the refugee to the country that he or she fled. So we're coming up against certain legal contradictions that we're hoping we can push on and say, well, look, you can't have your cake and eat it. There's got to be a compromise. You cannot violate the convention. What kind of compromise solution could we find? I think our students are mostly between the ages, I would say, 22 and 40. And we still have a long way to go on making our gender quota. We really do. I think women are really, really disadvantaged due to those regulations, that even if they followed the Kenyan secondary school curriculum and they did get their secondary school leaving certificate, their grades are just not good enough to meet the requirements of the universities, and the universities need to move a little bit. I mean, I've had some success in the past on saying, well, could we admit, a female applicant with a D+ rather than, asking for the C- as a minimum. And since we have the scholarship available, we could make it contingent on the candidate really showing to us during the first term that she is actually able to follow the curriculum and can prove to us that she gets grades that are good enough to keep her on. So I found some solutions that can work. It's now, developing those solutions into policy. That's where we need to work with the ministries of education, because it's not enough to work with the universities, because, as I said, they basically have to implement what the ministries are what's national policy.
I've kept you long enough, but I do want to ask, before I let you go, What is the motivation?
To me, the motivation to work in these contexts was really an intellectual one to begin with. And, coming from the learning sciences and having spent my research life studying expertise and how people develop expertise in different areas, and the focus was obviously on interpreting. What I asked myself was, well, how do people learn in those contexts? So what is possible, and how can they learn, and how do they overcome those challenges, and how can we develop pedagogical approaches that include technology, because it was clear from the beginning that without technology it wasn't going to work. That there had to be, a technological component to it whenever that was feasible, and really studying how people in those contexts, what motivates them to learn. And that hasn't left me. I still, well, I've gone beyond that, obviously. Haven't been able to do laboratory style studies on how people learn. The kinds of research projects I was involved in cognitive neuroscience and looking at MRIs. No, you can't do that in a refugee camp. Obviously, it's not possible. But we are gathering we're gathering more information about how people learn and what pedagogical approaches really develop resilient and motivated human beings, and that's for us really what counts most, that we have a holistic approach to this, and we've just released our integrative social emotional learning concept, which brings together the sports and the arts and engineering. No, this is not your Harvard model of social emotional learning, but hey, sports is incredibly important for youth, develops all manner of skills that from team work to just well-being, physical well-being. The arts, in Africa, do I need to say anything about that? No, the continent is just awash in, incredibly impressive artistic, examples. And engineering, yeah, you need to find solutions where you are. And I think the basic concepts of engineering are within reach of everyone, even if you're not technically minded. So that's how I feel. I continue to draw on my psychology background in questioning approaches for the continent, in adapting them. So when we talk about sports in Kenya, yeah, running is a national pastime, right? Well, okay, I have to admit, I'm a long distance runner, so it's also something, that speaks to me. And I do occasionally still get to train in a running camp in Kenya. So I have a small group there, and I end up doing some altitude training there, and I still run ultra races. So it's something that really binds me, I think, with the Kenyan culture, especially in, the East African culture in general. So I think very highly of sports, but I've seen just incredible contributions in the arts, and I think we need to draw on what the continent's strengths are and not constantly emphasize what its weaknesses are. And I'm really tired of that talk about, even at the beginning of the pandemic, all these headlines, I'm sure you've seen them, how the continent, none of that happened, right? If you look at the per capita, I'm sorry, and still it is not being properly advertised. It's not properly reflected. We are being constantly brainwashed with this negative, view of the continent and how they need our help. And I think that's something that I find very, very disconcerting and frustrating often. But we are hoping that, with our network, we can, bring examples and showcase that this is not true. And, we can show you that actually there is incredible capacity. There is a lot of enthusiasm. And yes, not everything works like clockwork. Well, nor does it work like clockwork anywhere else. So I think, we're good.
Well, the sooner we get kids, young and old, back out into the playing fields and get you back out onto the open road running, the better for all of us. This has been a delight. You've been so generous with your time, and I can only apologize for subjecting you to another virtual call. But
No worries.
I'm sure this is going to be of great value to the eLearning Africa audience. Barbara, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Rob. It was a pleasure talking to you, and thanks for your questions. And yeah, every question also helps me also reflect and connect some dots.
Many thanks to Barbara for her time, and thanks to you too for listening. If you've enjoyed our time together, please rate and subscribe to the podcast and share it widely. For more information on the courses, webinars, and virtual events that eLearning Africa has available, please visit elearning-africa.com.